take the body somewhere else and yuck the Tharshians the Marys.
You just crossed a legal line.
Absolutely not, Cynthia Halbrook said, heels planted on the gravel as if she owned the ground beneath them. This burial isn't authorized. You need to leave, now. The iron gate behind her was half closed, chains rattling softly in the morning air, the sound cutting sharper than her voice. The board chair didn't raise it. She didn't have to. The enforcer in crimson knew exactly how much space she was taking up. The tyrant in heels stood between us and the open earth, chin lifted, clipboard tucked under one arm like a badge. I looked past her, at the narrow strip of grass just inside the fence, and said quietly, "This land was dedicated to the city in 1894. Your bylaws don't reach past that marker." Her smile twitched, just for a second, enough to tell me she hadn't expected that. If you've ever felt that electric moment when someone abusing power realizes they might have misjudged you, stay with me and hit the subscribe button now. My name is Daniel Whitmore. I'd spent years advising municipalities on zoning boundaries, easements, and land use authority, but standing there, I wasn't a consultant or an attorney. I was a father holding a folded burial permit in one hand and a weight in my chest that refused to settle. The clipboard queen didn't know that yet. She only saw another neighbor she could overrun. Cynthia Halbrook stepped closer, lowering her voice as if that made the threat cleaner. She talked about community standards, about approvals, about consequences. The words blurred together, bouncing off the hum in my ears. I felt the gravel through the soles of my shoes, the cold edge of the morning pressing through my jacket, the way my hands shook no matter how tightly I clenched them. This wasn't about landscaping or noise complaints or some petty rule buried on page 12 of a handbook. This was about the smallest coffin I'd ever seen, waiting in the back of a hearse that hadn't turned off its engine yet. It was about a child who never took a breath, but still had a name, still had a place in our family, still deserved a place in the ground beside generations who came before. "Daniel," my wife whispered behind me, her fingers brushing my sleeve. That touch anchored me more than anything else could. The board chair didn't look at her. The enforcer in crimson didn't look at the hearse. She stared straight at me, daring me to break first. Around us, a few neighbors had stopped at the edge of the path, pretending to check their phones, pretending not to listen. The tyrant in heels thrived on that silence. It fed her. I asked myself briefly where you might be watching this from. Your kitchen table, a quiet living room, maybe somewhere you never thought you'd hear a story like this. Wherever you are, imagine being told that your grief needed approval. Cynthia Halbrook gestured toward the gate, her bracelets clinking. She said the HOA had jurisdiction. She said the board had voted. She said there would be fines, liens, enforcement. Each word landed like a shove. The clipboard queen was building a wall out of threats, confident it would hold. I looked down at the stone marker set just off the path, half hidden by grass, its lettering worn but still legible if you knew what to look for. Municipal, burial, grounds. The words mattered. They always had. "This isn't your call," I said, keeping my voice steady, even as my pulse hammered. "And you know it." Her eyes flicked again to the marker. Just a glance. Just enough. The enforcer in crimson recovered quickly, straightening, doubling down, but the moment had passed. Something had shifted. The tyrant in heels had overplayed her hand, and she didn't even realize it yet. Behind me, the hearse idled. In front of me, the gate waited, and standing between us all was a woman who thought authority was something you could wear and never have questioned. She didn't step aside. The gate stayed chained, the engine behind me humming. Cynthia Halbrook smoothed her blazer, already turning away as if the decision were settled. Neighbors lingered at the path's edge, watching the enforcer in crimson reclaim control, believing silence would protect them from consequences they feared most. I walked toward the path, away from the gate, needing air. Gravel gave way to concrete, the morning brighter than it deserved. The board chair's voice carried sharp and rehearsed, telling anyone nearby that rules were rules, and compassion was not her department today for grieving families like mine everywhere. Along the walking loop, people whispered without speaking. A woman lowered her eyes. A man nodded once, apologetic. They'd seen this before. The clipboard queen thrived on quiet compliance, issuing warnings about trash bins, paint shades, holiday lights, training residents to look away when power crossed lines repeatedly without consequence. I followed the curve past trimmed hedges and benches, listening. Stories surfaced in fragments: a blocked ramp, a playground sign removed, a citation for parking near the curb. The tyrant in heels enforced preferences like law, blurring boundaries until neighbors forgot what belonged to the city at all anymore entirely. My phone vibrated with messages I didn't open. Each step carried me farther from the gate, closer to understanding the pattern. This wasn't grief-provoking cruelty. It was opportunity. The board chair sensed vulnerability and pressed harder, counting on exhaustion to force surrender before questions could form in public spaces. I stopped near the old marker again, pretending to read a notice. The stone sat where it always had, ignored yet undeniable. Municipal ground, public trust. Words etched deeper than any HOA memo. The enforcer in crimson could posture, but posture didn't move boundaries drawn generations earlier by lawful authority. Behind me, footsteps approached, then slowed. No one spoke. Fear has a sound, a careful quiet. The clipboard queen relied on it. She framed resistance as troublemaking, painting dissenters as selfish. Watching neighbors shrink confirmed her strategy worked until someone refused to absorb the shame she distributed so easily again. I thought about timing, about pressure points. The burial clock didn't pause for HOA theatrics. Deadlines existed outside her reach. The board chair's threats created records whether she intended them or not. Each notice, each warning, stacked into something heavier than intimidation, with consequences that would travel beyond her office. At the path's bend, a retired couple finally spoke, voices low. They described letters, meetings, pressure. Nothing illegal, they said, just relentless. That distinction mattered. Overreach often hides behind procedure. The tyrant in heels perfected that camouflage, mistaking compliance for consent from residents conditioned to endure quietly for peace alone. I thanked them and kept moving, pulse steadying. The outrage sharpened into focus. This wasn't a personal feud. It was jurisdiction masquerading as taste. The board chair wielded authority where none existed, betting no one would test the line while grieving blurred resolve and sapped energy from resistance efforts early. I circled back toward the gate, hearing the chain again. The enforcer in crimson was still there, performing certainty for an audience. She didn't notice the shift around her. Patterns, once seen, can't be unseen. And patterns create leverage when law finally asks who truly holds power over public ground. My wife met my eyes as I returned, reading the answer in my face. We wouldn't beg. We wouldn't rush blindly. The clipboard queen had shown her hand, and the community had shown its fear. Both would matter soon, when the right questions were asked aloud by people who listened. I stopped beside the hearse, the engine finally quiet. The gate remained closed, but something else opened. Understanding, momentum. Cynthia Hallbrook believed control was permanent. She was wrong. Standing on that path, I knew the boundary she crossed would be the one that ended her reign within the community forever. The HOA office smelled like toner and stale coffee, a narrow room dressed up as authority. Cynthia Hallbrook sat at the head of the table, legs crossed, red blazer immaculate, the board chair already recounting the morning as if it were settled history. The enforcer in crimson spoke with practiced calm, outlining violations, timelines, consequences, never once acknowledging the hearse parked outside the gate. I stood near the doorway, listening, watching. Across from her sat Laura Mendel, the HOA secretary, shoulders tight, fingers wrapped too firmly around a pen. The clipboard queen talked, but Laura didn't write. She nodded at the wrong moments, eyes flicking to the window, then to the floor, then back to the tyrant in heels as if checking which reaction was safest. Cynthia Hallbrook slid a folder across the table and tapped it twice. Laura flinched. It was small, almost invisible, but it was there. The board chair didn't notice. She was busy enjoying the sound of her own certainty, explaining how authority worked when people forgot their place and needed reminding. Laura's pen hovered, her jaw clenched. She adjusted her chair, the scrape loud in the quiet room. When the enforcer in crimson asked for confirmation, Laura opened her mouth, closed it again, then nodded once. Too fast, too sharp, not agreement, survival. I remembered faces like hers from hearings and council rooms, people trapped between truth and employment. The clipboard queen thrived on that tension. She stacked it carefully, knowing most people would choose silence over conflict, especially when conflict came dressed as policy and procedure. The board chair leaned back, satisfied, heels clicking against the floor. She declared the matter closed, warned of fines, hinted at liens. The tyrant in heels loved finality. It made her feel untouchable. Laura's shoulders sank another inch, as if the air had thickened around her. I asked a single question about jurisdiction. Cynthia Holbrook waved it away, smiling thinly. Laura's eyes snapped up. For half a second they met mine. There was fear there, and something else. Recognition. The enforcer in crimson stood, signaling the meeting's end. Chairs moved, papers shuffled. Laura gathered documents with trembling hands, stacking them twice before they aligned. She dropped a page, bent too quickly to retrieve it, cheeks flushed. The clipboard queen didn't help. She didn't have to. As I turned to leave, I heard Laura exhale, a shaky breath she thought no one noticed. The sound followed me into the hallway. It told me more than any confession could have. Pressure leaves marks, even when words stay locked behind teeth. Outside, the sun felt harsher. The gate was still chained. Cynthia Holbrook emerged moments later, mask firmly in place, the board chair resuming her performance for anyone watching. The tyrant in heels thrived in daylight, where confidence passed for legitimacy. Laura lingered in the doorway. She didn't join Cynthia. She watched the ground, then the marker beyond the fence. Her foot shifted back, then forward, indecision playing out in inches. When Cynthia Holbrook called her name, Laura startled, nodded, and followed, but her pace was slower, reluctant. I stood there, absorbing it. The conflicted witness had revealed herself without a word. Fear, guilt, knowledge, all written in posture and hesitation. The enforcer in crimson believed loyalty was secured. She was wrong. As the HOA office door closed, I understood something crucial. Power fractures where conscience lives. Laura Mendel was standing on that fracture, trying not to fall. And when this broke open, she would matter more than Cynthia Holbrook ever imagined. I felt the weight of the moment settle, heavy and precise. The chain, the marker, the silence, all aligned. Grief sharpened into purpose. I didn't know how she'd choose yet. I only knew the truth had found a place to stand, and it wouldn't move again. Not today. Not tomorrow. Not after courts finally spoke publicly. The notice was already taped to my front door when we got home, the paper fluttering in the late afternoon breeze like it had been waiting for us. Cynthia Holbrook didn't deliver it herself, of course. The board chair preferred distance when escalating, letting official language do the bruising while she stayed clean. Inside, the house felt hollow. Shoes by the entry, the quiet hum of the refrigerator. I peeled the notice free and read it once, then again. Unauthorized access, violation of community standards, immediate penalties pending. The enforcer in crimson had moved fast. Another envelope slid through the mail slot before I could sit down. Then another. The clipboard queen was stacking pressure, counting on exhaustion to finish what intimidation started at the gate. Each page carried her confidence, her assumption that authority multiplied when repeated often enough. I spread the papers across the kitchen table. My wife watched from the doorway, arms folded tight, eyes glassy but steady. The tyrant in heels had chosen our home as the next battlefield, transforming grief into a compliance exercise. It was calculated. It was cruel. The phone rang. Unknown number. I let it go to voicemail. A minute later, an email notification chimed. Then another. Cynthia Holbrook wasn't speaking directly anymore. She didn't need to. The board chair had unleashed the machinery, and it was loud. I stepped onto the porch, needing air. Across the street, a neighbor pretended to water plants, glancing up just long enough to register the stack of papers in my hand. Fear travels fast in neighborhoods like this. The enforcer in crimson understood that better than anyone. A courier van pulled up, hazard lights blinking. Another envelope, certified. The clipboard queen wanted proof that we'd received her warnings. She wanted a trail. She wanted leverage. What she didn't realize was how carefully she was documenting her reach. I signed, pen scratching hard. The driver left. I leaned against the railing, feeling the wood bite into my palms. The tyrant in heels believed escalation meant dominance. She believed volume equaled legitimacy. That belief had undone others before her. Inside, my wife set the envelopes aside, hands deliberate. "How far will she go?" she asked quietly. "As far as she thinks no one will stop her," I said. The answer settled between us, heavy but clarifying. Cynthia Halbrook was daring us to fold, to retreat quietly and disappear. She was betting grief would make us pliable. The doorbell rang again. This time, a uniformed security contractor stood outside, clipboard in hand, rehearsed sympathy in his eyes. He recited policy, mentioned enforcement, avoided looking past me into the house. The enforcer in crimson had outsourced intimidation now, widening the circle. I listened, nodded once, and closed the door without responding. Silence can be louder than protest. The clipboard queen hated silence when it wasn't hers. As evening fell, the notices kept coming digitally, warnings layered on warnings. Cynthia Halbrook was building a tower of threats. Certain height meant strength. She didn't see the foundation cracking under the weight of her own overreach. I gathered the papers into a single stack and slid them into my bag. Not to hide them, to keep them close. Each page was a step she took without looking down. Each signature, each timestamp, a marker she'd regret ignoring. The house grew quiet again. Outside, porch lights blinked on up and down the street. Somewhere beyond the roofs, the gate remained chained, but here, in our living room, something hardened into resolve. The tyrant in heels had escalated, and in doing so, she'd crossed from nuisance into liability. The office lights hummed softly as I closed the door behind me, the familiar space steadying my breathing. Cynthia Halbrook's notices sat in my bag, but I didn't open them. I didn't need to. The board chair had already told me everything she intended through action, and action is where jurisdiction leaves fingerprints. I rolled my chair to the window and looked out over the municipal buildings across the street. Years ago, I'd helped redraw boundary maps after a flood shifted a creek. Lines matter. Authority lives and dies by them. The enforcer in crimson was pretending lines could be wished away. I pulled up the city's GIS portal, not searching, just confirming what I already knew from practice. The graveyard parcel sat shaded differently than the surrounding lots, a public dedication that predated the HOA by decades. The clipboard queen's claims collided with that reality like glass. I leaned back, letting the memory surface. Cemeteries aren't amenities, they're trusts. Once dedicated, they're governed by statute, not preference. Boards can posture, but they can't annex history. The tyrant in heels had mistaken proximity for power. My phone buzzed, another automated warning. I silenced it. Instead, I sketched the sequence on a legal pad. Not evidence, just logic. Incorporation date. Dedication date. Standing. Remedies. The order settled cleanly. Inevitable. I called a colleague who'd sat through more boundary disputes than anyone I knew. I didn't ask for files. I asked a question. Could a private association assert control over municipally dedicated burial grounds without an easement or transfer? He laughed once, short and incredulous. Not a chance. That was the moment the fog lifted. Cynthia Halbrook wasn't enforcing rules. She was trespassing into authority she didn't possess. Every notice, every threat, amplified the mistake. The board chair had built her case against herself by insisting too loudly. I stood and paced, energy returning to my limbs. The enforcer in crimson would escalate again. She always did, and escalation would trigger the exact scrutiny she feared. Standing challenges don't need drama. They need a clean record of overreach. I drafted a timeline from memory, anchoring events to places and witnesses. Gate, path, office, home, each location distinct, each action hers. The clipboard queen's pattern was now a map. Outside, sirens wailed briefly, then faded. The city kept moving, indifferent to HOA theatrics. That indifference was protection. Municipal authority doesn't bend for bluster. It waits. I packed my bag and headed out. Resolve settled. The tyrant in heels thought pressure would break us. Instead, it clarified the law. She had crossed onto ground that answers to courts, not clipboards. And courts are merciless when standing collapses. I paused at the curb, feeling the evening cool my face, and considered the next move carefully. This phase wasn't about confrontation. It was about letting procedure expose arrogance. Cynthia Hallbrook would send more notices, summon contractors, maybe even call police, believing volume could manufacture power. Each step would widen the record. Each misstep would sharpen standing. The board chair couldn't help herself. The enforcer in crimson equated motion with control. The clipboard queen trusted templates. The tyrant in heels believed fear would substitute for law. It wouldn't. Tomorrow, agencies would be notified, not accused, simply informed. Boundaries would be acknowledged, not argued. And when oversight arrived, it would arrive quietly, with questions that demanded answers. I crossed the street toward the parking garage, keys cold in my hand, knowing the path ahead was narrow but firm. Grief still ached, but purpose steadied it. The ground she claimed would answer to history, statutes, and judges, not to her. That certainty carried me home, ready to wait, to watch, and to let her mistakes speak louder than any argument I could make. By morning, the law would be awake, and so would everyone else. That was enough. For now, it was. Always had been. Quietly. The county building was quiet in a way that felt deliberate, carpet-swallowing footsteps, fluorescent lights steady and indifferent. I took a number and sat beneath a seal I'd seen 100 times in other contexts. The words about public trust suddenly heavier. Cynthia Hallbrook's pressure echoed in my head, but it sounded smaller here. When my number flashed, I followed it to a window framed by thick glass. The registrar listened without interruption, eyes moving from my face to the permit, then to the clock on the wall. She explained timelines in a measured voice, deadlines set by statute, not preference. The enforcer in crimson wasn't part of the equation. I asked about interference. The registrar's brow tightened. She asked where the burial ground was located. I named it. She nodded once, already knowing. Public grounds, she said, dedicated long before private associations learned to market control. The clipboard queen's threats didn't slow the clock. They complicated it. A form slid under the glass. Not a solution, a safeguard. If access was blocked, the county would need to document why. Documentation triggered review. Review triggered oversight. The tyrant in heels had no patience for oversight. That impatience would matter. My phone buzzed again. Another message from the board chair's address, curt and confident. I didn't open it. The registrar watched my reaction anyway, seeing enough. She asked if there had been notices. I said yes. She asked if they were ongoing. I said yes again. Her pen paused. Then time matters, she said, lowering her voice. The law protects families first in these moments. Interference invites scrutiny. She didn't threaten. She didn't promise. She stated reality. Cynthia Hallbrook's escalation had shortened her own runway. I stepped aside to let the next person through, heart beating steadier. Outside the glass doors, the afternoon sun felt sharp. I stood on the steps and called my wife, explaining the clock, the stakes, the way procedure cuts through bluster. She listened, breathing slow, anchoring me. I rolled my chair to the window and looked out over the municipal buildings across the street. Years ago, I'd helped redraw boundary maps after a flood shifted a creek. Lines matter. Authority lives and dies by them. The enforcer in crimson was pretending lines could be wished away. I pulled up the city's GIS portal, not searching, just confirming what I already knew from practice. The graveyard parcel sat shaded differently than the surrounding lots, a public dedication that predated the HOA by decades. The clipboard queen's claims collided with that reality like glass. I leaned back, letting the memory surface. Cemeteries aren't amenities, they're trusts. Once dedicated, they're governed by statute, not preference. Boards can posture, but they can't annex history. The tyrant in heels had mistaken proximity for power. As I ended the call, a security vehicle idled at the curb. HOA logo on the door. The enforcer in crimson was expanding her theater. I watched the driver check his phone, waiting for instruction. The tyrant in heels wanted presence to feel like authority. I walked past without acknowledging him, letting the moment record itself. Cameras, witnesses, timestamps. Standing grows from mundane details. The clipboard queen didn't understand that quiet compliance is fragile when law wakes up. Back at the car, I laid the papers on the seat and traced the sequence again. Gate blocked. Notices delivered. Access denied. County informed. The pattern was complete. The board chair had forced urgency into the open where it belonged. I drove toward the neighborhood, not to confront, but to observe. At the entrance, Cynthia Hallbrook stood with two contractors, gesturing toward the gate. The enforcer in crimson spoke quickly, pointing, performing certainty. I parked across the street and watched from a distance. She hadn't slowed. She couldn't. The tyrant in heels believed momentum would save her. It wouldn't. The clock the registrar described ticked louder with every order Cynthia Halbrook gave. Each instruction risked crossing from nuisance into obstruction. I started the engine and pulled away, resolve firm. Tonight, agencies would be notified of interference, not accusations, just facts. Tomorrow, oversight would ask questions, and when questions arrive, authority must prove itself. Cynthia Halbrook would be asked to do what she'd avoided all along. Show standing, she didn't have it. The realization settled, heavy and calm. Grief still hurt, but urgency had shape now. The law had entered the room, and it wasn't impressed by heels or clipboards. It never is. It just counts days, lines, and limits. And it was counting now. I breathed, steady, ready to wait, to watch, and to let the truth surface without shouting, without fear, for everyone involved. At last. Laura Mendel didn't call. She texted a single line that lit my phone just after dusk. Can we talk? Somewhere not here, no punctuation, no explanation. Fear compressed into 8 words. We met at a small park on the edge of the development, far enough from the HOA office that Cynthia Halbrook wouldn't casually pass by, close enough that Laura didn't feel like she was disappearing. The benches were empty, the air cooling fast. Streetlights hummed on one by one, steady and indifferent. Laura arrived late, scanning the path before sitting. She kept her purse on her lap, fingers locked around the strap. When she spoke, her voice stayed low, eyes never quite meeting mine. The enforcer in crimson wasn't here, but her shadow was. I shouldn't be doing this, she said, then stopped, swallowed, tried again. She's already angry. The board chair had that effect on people. Cynthia Halbrook ruled by anticipation, by making consequences feel inevitable even before they existed. Laura shifted, crossing and uncrossing her ankles, the movement restless, rehearsed. I saw the notices, Laura continued. All of them. She's escalating because she thinks speed will protect her. I waited. Silence gives permission. Laura exhaled, shoulders sagging. The cemetery was never transferred, she said finally. Not when the HOA formed, not after. It was excluded on purpose. The words landed cleanly, not dramatic, definitive. She explained without embellishment, hands finally loosening. When the HOA incorporated, the boundary maps carved carefully around the burial ground. Municipal dedication stayed intact. No easement, no lease, no management agreement. The clipboard queen knew this, or she should have. She told us to stop asking questions, Laura said, voice tightening. Said it wasn't our job to understand history. I pictured Cynthia Halbrook at the head of the table, red blazer sharp, dismissing caution as weakness. The tyrant in heels didn't tolerate reminders of limits. Limits made her smaller. Laura leaned forward now, urgency breaking through fear. She's afraid of precedent. If she admits she has no authority there, people will start pushing back everywhere else. There it was. Motive. Control, not compliance. She told me to shred an old map, Laura added, then froze, eyes wide. I didn't. I couldn't. Her hands shook as she spoke, confession pouring out in fragments, emails instructing silence, meetings framed as unanimous when they weren't. Cynthia Halbrook using urgency to blur legality. The enforcer in crimson mistook obedience for loyalty. I can't keep pretending, Laura said, voice cracking. Not after what she did to you. The park felt smaller, the air heavier. I didn't interrupt. Confessions need space. She thinks no one will challenge standing, Laura continued. She thinks grief makes people careless. I nodded once. It doesn't, I said quietly. It makes lines clearer. Laura finally looked at me then, eyes wet but steady. If this goes to court, she said, I'll tell the truth. The sentence cost her something. I could see it in the way she pressed her lips together afterward, bracing for consequences that hadn't arrived yet. We sat in silence for a moment, the streetlight buzzing overhead. Somewhere closer to the center of the neighborhood, a car alarm chirped and stopped. Life went on, oblivious. She's going to double down, Laura warned. Cynthia Halbrook always does. I know, I said. That's why this matters. Laura stood, smoothing her jacket, composure returning in layers. I can't be seen with you again, she said. Not yet. I understand. As she walked away, I watched her shoulders straighten with each step. Fear was still there, but so was resolve. The conflicted witness had chosen a side, even if she had to stand on it quietly for now. I stayed on the bench after she left, replaying her words, excluded on purpose, never transferred, afraid of precedent. The board chair's entire campaign rested on a lie she'd repeated until it felt true. The tyrant in heels had crossed from overreach into exposure, and now she wasn't alone in the spotlight. Neither was I. I stood and headed back toward the car, the path lit clearly ahead. The strategy was no longer theoretical, it had a voice, and that voice had finally decided to speak. I went to the public law library before dawn, choosing quiet over confrontation, certainty over impulse. The building smelled like dust and paper, the kind of place where authority shed its costumes and showed its bones. Cynthia Hallbrook thrived on performance. Here, performance meant nothing. I claimed a table near the windows and laid out my notebook, not to hunt for secrets, but to assemble what I already knew. The board chair's pattern was clear now. Pressure, speed, silence. The enforcer in crimson mistook motion for power, never pausing long enough to test whether the ground beneath her actually belonged to her. I mapped the strategy in my head, clean and narrow. No accusations, no speeches. Standing lives and questions, asked at the right moment by the right authority. The clipboard queen had created the record herself. Notices, threats, contractors, security. Each action assumed jurisdiction. Assumptions collapse when examined. I reviewed the calendar first. Burial timelines, county review windows, court availability. Time wasn't my enemy anymore. Cynthia Hallbrook had turned it into leverage by forcing urgency into the open. The tyrant in heels couldn't undo that now. I moved through statutes I knew by heart, not reading, confirming. Public dedication statutes don't bend. Cemeteries are trusts, protected because grief demands protection. Private associations can't annex them by proximity or habit. The board chair's entire stance depended on no one asking the obvious question: where did your authority come from? I wrote that question at the top of the page and circled it. Then I built the path beneath it. County notification, registrar documentation, oversight inquiry, standing challenge. Each step triggered by the last, each requiring nothing from me except restraint. The enforcer in crimson would supply the rest by insisting. I thought about Laura Mendel, her voice steadying as she spoke the truth she'd been carrying alone. Her testimony wasn't the strategy, it was the accelerant. Cynthia Hallbrook's fear of precedent would push her into the light faster than any subpoena. I closed my eyes briefly, letting grief wash through without drowning me. Preparation requires calm. Rage scatters. The clipboard queen counted on emotion to provoke mistakes. I wouldn't give her that. Footsteps echoed between shelves. An older woman nodded politely as she passed. The world here was measured, orderly, immune to theatrics. It reminded me why standing matters. Law doesn't care who shouts. It cares who is authorized to act. I drafted the notices I wouldn't send yet, phrased neutrally, factual, inviting review. Agencies respond to clarity. Courts respond to restraint. The tyrant in heels would read politeness as weakness. She always did. That misread would be fatal to her position. By mid-morning, the plan was complete, simple enough to withstand interference. I packed my bag and left the library without drama. Outside, the city hummed, buses sighing at stops, people moving with purpose. Authority here was diffuse, shared, accountable. My phone buzzed as I crossed the plaza. Another message from Cynthia Hallbrook, clipped and certain. I didn't open it. The board chair needed me reactive. I needed her predictable. I paused at the curb and looked back once at the building. Preparation finished, the next phase required patience. The enforcer in crimson would escalate again, mistaking silence for surrender. The clipboard queen would press harder, documenting her reach with every step. I turned toward the car, steady, knowing the trap was set by her own hand. Standing would do the rest. The law doesn't rush. It waits for arrogance to arrive on schedule. And Cynthia Hallbrook was nothing if not punctual. I chose a neutral place on purpose, a small cafe near the transit stop where conversations dissolved into steam and clinking cups. Cynthia Hallbrook preferred closed rooms. The board chair controlled those. Here, control thinned. I arrived early and took a corner table, back to the wall, sightlines clear. The enforcer in crimson wouldn't see a trap because there wasn't one, only preparation. I ordered coffee I didn't drink and watched the door. First came the registrar's follow-up email, brief and procedural, confirming receipt of the interference notice. I forwarded it exactly once to an oversight inbox that logged without comment. The clipboard queen loved replies. Silence unnerved her. A couple slid into the booth behind me, whispering about assessments. I caught fragments, enough to know Cynthia Hallbrook's pressure was spreading. The tyrant in heels had a rhythm: escalate publicly, intimidate privately, deny accountability later. Patterns invite witnesses. My phone vibrated again. A photo this time. The gate. 2 contractors. A security vehicle. The board chair staging authority like a set piece. I saved it without responding. Timestamps matter. I met a neighbor who'd asked to talk, a quiet man with a folded cap and careful eyes. We didn't shake hands. We didn't need to. He spoke about warnings, about access denied to a path he'd walked for years. Not my case, but adjacent. Adjacent is enough. I listened, asked where and when, wrote nothing down. Memory is cleaner than notes when stories converge. The enforcer in crimson had created convergence by insisting everywhere at once. When he left, I paid for both coffees and stayed put. Preparation isn't busy, it's selective. I sent neutral notifications to 2 agencies, phrased as courtesy updates, attaching nothing, alleging nothing, facts only, location, dates, actions observed. Standing invites questions. Questions invite answers. Across the room, a television murmured local news. A segment about zoning disputes flickered past. I watched Cynthia Hallbrook's world intersect with mine without touching yet. The clipboard queen underestimated proximity. She always had. Another message arrived, sharper now, threatening immediate action. I read it once, then archived it. The tyrant in heels was running out of runway and mistaking speed for lift. I finished the coffee at last and stood. Outside, buses hissed, commuters surged, the city indifferent to HOA theater. Indifference is power's enemy. At the corner, I paused and called Laura Mendel, letting it ring once before hanging up. A signal, not a conversation. She texted back a single word: ready. I walked the long way to the car, passing the boundary marker again. Municipal, burial, grounds, words that don't move. Cynthia Hallbrook could posture for crowds, but crowds don't grant standing. Law does. By evening, confirmations arrived quietly, acknowledgments without promises. That was enough. The board chair would escalate again tomorrow. The enforcer in crimson couldn't help herself. Each move would widen the circle, invite scrutiny, and narrow her options. I drove home as lights came on across the neighborhood. Windows glowed. People watched. Preparation had become momentum, not loud, not dramatic, relentless. The tyrant in heels had taught the community to look away. Now they were looking back. Night settled without ceremony, and I welcomed it. Darkness blurs theater and sharpens substance. Cynthia Hallbrook would mistake the quiet for weakness and schedule another display, another memo, another order. The board chair's certainty would carry her forward, straight into review. I didn't need to push. I needed to be present, consistent, and patient. Standing grows when arrogance repeats itself. By the time morning came, the record would be thicker, the questions louder, and the answers harder to dodge. I turned onto my street, parked, and sat for a moment, breathing evenly, ready for whatever escalation arrived next, knowing each step she took only tightened the frame around her. Tomorrow would confirm everything quietly, seeing authority measured, limited, and accountable at last for all. The emergency board session was called for noon, a time chosen to look urgent and authoritative. Cynthia Hallbrook liked daylight when asserting control. The HOA meeting room buzzed with low voices as residents filtered in, folding chairs, scraping against tile. The board chair stood at the front, red blazer sharp, posture confident, already rehearsing certainty. I took a seat near the back, unobtrusive, watching. The enforcer in crimson tapped her pen against the table, impatience leaking through polish. A stack of papers waited beside her, prepared statements meant to close doors, not open questions. The clipboard queen believed preparation equaled legitimacy. Cynthia Hallbrook opened the meeting without preamble, declaring the situation resolved, access denied, enforcement ongoing. She spoke fast, layering conclusions before anyone could interrupt. The tyrant in heels thrived on momentum, hoping speed would carry her past scrutiny. A hand went up, then another. Neighbors who'd never spoken before shifted forward. The board chair's smile tightened. Questions began politely. Jurisdiction, authority, Dates. The enforcer in crimson answered with generalities, deflecting specifics, pointing to bylaws without citing sections. The pattern repeated. I stayed silent. Strategy doesn't announce itself. Cynthia Hallbrook gestured to the security contractor, inviting him to confirm actions taken. He described the gate, the orders, the schedule. Each detail landed like a timestamp. The clipboard queen nodded, satisfied. She didn't hear what everyone else did. Assumption layered onto assumption. When a resident asked whether the cemetery was HOA property, the board chair waved it off, calling it adjacent, functionally part of the community. Adjacent isn't owned. The room shifted. The tyrant in heels pressed harder, insisting adjacency was enough. That was the moment oversight arrived, quietly. A county official entered, badge visible but unobtrusive, clipboard neutral. Conversations stuttered. Cynthia Hallbrook faltered for half a beat, then recovered, welcoming the presence as cooperation. The enforcer in crimson straightened, confident she could manage this too. The official asked a single question, voice calm. On what authority was access denied to municipally dedicated burial grounds? Silence spread. The clipboard queen flipped pages, searching for language that didn't exist. Cynthia Hallbrook spoke anyway, asserting board votes, community standards, safety concerns. None answered the question. The official nodded, asked for documentation of transfer or easement. The tyrant in heels gestured vaguely, promising to provide it later. Promises don't establish standing. The room felt smaller. Laura Mendel sat at the side table, hands folded, eyes fixed on the floor. When the official asked who maintained records, Laura looked up. The board chair turned toward her, warning sharp in her stare. Laura's shoulders rose, then settled. There is no transfer, Laura said, voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. The cemetery was excluded at incorporation. The words cut cleanly. The enforcer in crimson froze. The clipboard queen stared. Cynthia Hallbrook's color shifted. Anger flashing before control snapped back into place. The official thanked Laura and made notes. He explained next steps, review, temporary suspension of enforcement pending verification. The tyrant in heels objected loudly, calling it overreach. Irony hung thick. Residents murmured. Phones lifted. The board chair tried to adjourn, but the official hadn't finished. Standing would be examined. Orders would pause. Access would be restored unless lawful authority was shown. Cynthia Hallbrook slammed her folder shut, heels clicking as she stood. The performance cracked. The enforcer in crimson gathered papers too quickly. The clipboard queen's certainty evaporated under fluorescent lights. I remained seated until the room began to empty. Strategy implemented, not by force, but by exposure. The tyrant in heels had insisted on a stage. On that stage, her authority dissolved. As I stood to leave, the gate's image flashed in my mind. Chains loosening, air moving again. Outside, the day continued, indifferent to theater. Inside, the board chair's reign had met its limit. The law had arrived, asked its question, and waited. The answer wasn't coming. The courthouse steps were already crowded when we arrived, voices overlapping, cameras angling for position. Cynthia Hallbrook stood near the entrance, red blazer unmistakable, the board chair projecting confidence like armor. The enforcer in crimson hovered close, whispering reminders, while the clipboard queen clutched a folder as if paper alone could anchor authority. Inside, the courtroom settled into a tense hush. Wooden benches creaked as neighbors filled every row, curiosity mixing with quiet anger. The tyrant in heels chose a front seat, posture rigid, chin high, daring the room to challenge her version of events. I took my place behind counsel's table, hands steady, eyes forward. Proceedings began without ceremony. The judge listened, expression unreadable, as the board chair outlined her justification. Cynthia Hallbrook spoke of safety, order, community harmony. She avoided the word authority, substituting intention instead. The enforcer in crimson nodded along, confident repetition would harden claims into fact. Then questions came. Simple ones. Dates, boundaries, transfers. The clipboard queen shuffled pages, producing bylaws, minutes, resolutions. None addressed the core issue. The tyrant in heels grew sharper, voice rising, insisting adjacency conferred control. Murmurs rippled through the gallery. The judge raised a hand. Silence snapped into place. He asked whether the HOA possessed standing over municipally dedicated burial grounds. Cynthia Hallbrook answered quickly, citing votes and enforcement history. The words sounded practiced. They didn't answer the question. A county attorney stood next, measured and calm, laying out the dedication, the incorporation exclusions, the absence of any easement. Each sentence narrowed the frame. The enforcer in crimson stiffened. The clipboard queen's grip tightened. Laura Mendel was called. She walked to the stand slowly, shoulders squared despite the weight pressing down. Cynthia Halbrook stared, warning flashing across her face. Laura met it once, then looked away. Laura testified plainly. Maps excluded the cemetery. Records confirmed it. No transfer existed, no authority granted. The tyrant in heels shook her head, scoffing, but the room listened. Phones lifted. Neighbors leaned forward. Cross-examination came sharp and fast. Cynthia Halbrook's counsel tried to rattle Laura, suggesting confusion, misinterpretation. Laura answered carefully, breathing through each response. Truth doesn't rush. The enforcer in crimson watched, realizing control had slipped beyond reach. When it was my turn, I spoke briefly, not to persuade, but to clarify. Standing isn't emotional. It's structural. Authority must be shown, not assumed. The judge nodded once, already there, arguments closed. The courtroom waited. Cynthia Halbrook whispered urgently to her counsel, heels tapping. The clipboard queen stared at the floor. The tyrant in heels had lost the room, and she knew it. The judge returned quickly. His ruling was direct. The HOA lacked standing. Enforcement was void. Interference unlawful. Access restored immediately. Further action barred. The words landed heavy, final. Gasps broke the silence. A woman cried softly. A man exhaled hard. Cameras clicked. Cynthia Halbrook's face drained of color. The enforcer in crimson froze. The clipboard queen closed her folder, hands trembling. The judge warned against retaliation, citing consequences. He dismissed the matter with a final glance that brooked no appeal. Authority had been measured and found wanting. Outside, the crowd spilled onto the steps, voices rising. Cynthia Halbrook pushed through, refusing eye contact, heels striking stone too loudly. The tyrant in heels had been unmasked in public, her certainty stripped away. I stood there, breathing in cool air, feeling grief ease its grip just enough. Justice isn't loud, it's precise. And today, it spoke clearly, for everyone watching, for everyone who'd been afraid to ask where power truly came from. The gate was open when we returned, chains gone, hinges quiet in the early morning light. Cynthia Halbrook wasn't there. The board chair had vanished from the place she once guarded so fiercely, her authority dissolved by daylight and law. The enforcer in crimson, the clipboard queen, the tyrant in heels, all those masks meant nothing now. What remained was space, ground, air. The graveyard felt different without resistance. Birds moved through the trees as if nothing had ever been wrong. The marker stood where it always had, stone cool and steady, words worn but unchanged. Municipal, burial, grounds. Permanence doesn't announce itself. It simply endures. Neighbors gathered at a respectful distance, some with hands folded, some wiping their eyes. They didn't speak much. They didn't need to. What mattered had already been said in court, in records, in the quiet courage of truth, finally allowed to stand. I felt the ache return as we stepped forward, sharp and familiar, but it no longer carried panic with it. Grief had room now. Dignity had been restored. Cynthia Halbrook's campaign had collapsed under its own weight, leaving behind a lesson written plainly for anyone willing to see it. The service was simple. No speeches, no spectacle, just presence. Just the understanding that some things are not subject to approval, not subject to control, not subject to the whims of people who mistake power for ownership. The tyrant in heels had learned that too late. As the earth was returned, I noticed Laura Mendel standing near the path, hands clasped, eyes down. She didn't approach. She didn't need to. Her choice had already echoed far beyond this place. Standing isn't always loud. Sometimes it's a quiet refusal to keep lying. When it was over, people lingered. Conversations began, tentative at first, then steadier. Stories surfaced, others who'd been warned, pressured, silenced. The board chair's reach had been wide, but it had limits now, drawn clearly by law and watched by a community that had learned where those lines truly were. Cynthia Halbrook would face consequences beyond this morning. Reviews, elections, scrutiny she could no longer outrun. The enforcer in crimson had relied on fear. Fear had failed her. The clipboard queen had trusted paper. Paper had turned against her. The tyrant in heels had demanded obedience. Obedience had expired. I stood by the marker a moment longer, letting the quiet settle. Justice doesn't erase loss. It makes room for it. It gives grief a place to stand without being pushed aside by arrogance or threat. As we walked back toward the gate, now permanently open, I felt something loosen inside me. Not relief exactly. Resolution. The knowledge that what was taken could not be returned, but what was denied had been restored. That mattered. If you want more stories of homeowners standing up to HOA tyranny, hit subscribe right now. Share your story in the comments, and let me know where you're watching from. The neighborhood looked different on the way out, not because the houses had changed, but because the silence had. People met my eyes, they nodded, some smiled, others simply stood taller. Authority had been corrected, and that correction rippled outward, subtle, but lasting. I didn't look back at the gate. I didn't need to. The boundary was clear now, etched deeper than any sign or notice Cynthia Halbrook had ever posted. The law had spoken, the community had listened, and the ground, patient as ever, had finally been allowed to do what it was meant to do all along. Cynthia Halbrook slammed her folder shut, heels clicking as she stood. The performance cracked. The enforcer in crimson gathered papers too quickly. The clipboard queen's certainty evaporated under fluorescent lights. I remained seated until the room began to empty. Strategy implemented, not by force, but by exposure. The tyrant in heels had insisted on a stage. On that stage, her authority dissolved.